So this lecture is all about herbivory and predation, so the content of chapter 14 in your textbooks. So just to give an overview of the general themes of the lecture, first of all I'll introduce what herbivory and predation are. Then I'll talk in more detail about herbivory and plant defences, so some of the ways that plants evade grazers and other herbivores. Then I'll talk about impacts of predators on prey populations, so some of the dynamics between predator and prey. And then finally I'll look at predator avoidance, so some of the strategies that organisms use to avoid predation. So just by way of introduction, herbivory and predation are exploitative interactions that enhance fitness of one individual and reduce fitness of the exploited individual. So as you might expect, these interactions have significant consequences for the population dynamics and the evolutionary trajectories of both of these species. So herbivory and plant defense. Herbivory is obviously a very widespread phenomenon, and it's led to the evolution of a huge number of plant defensive strategies. So Hawkes and Sullivan in 2001 conducted a meta-analysis of 81 studies of the effects of herbivory on plants. And what you'll find, not surprisingly, is that herbivory generally reduces plant growth and reproduction, so it has a negative fitness effect on plants. And that seems fairly obvious and intuitive, but there are exceptions to this. So in grasses, for example, growth rates often increase after herbivory if nutrients are abundant. So this idea of plant growth rate increasing in response to herbivory is really well demonstrated by this work that was done in subarctic salt marshes with grazing snow geese. So essentially what the researchers did was they cordoned off these exclosures, which are areas on the salt marsh that the geese wouldn't be able to get onto and wouldn't be able to graze. As you can see from this picture, inside the exclosure where there's no grazing, there's an obviously higher level of standing biomass. So there's longer grass within that exclosure than there is outside of it. And that idea was borne out in the data. So you can see from this graph, this compares the live above ground standing biomass in the exclosures compared to in the grazed land surrounding the exclosures. And you can see increased biomass in those exclosures compared to outside. So that's exactly what you would expect, but actually what they found is if they summed the cumulative above ground productivity in those exclosures and compared it to the productivity outside of the exclosures, productivity was actually higher outside of the exclosures. So although standing biomass in those exclosures is actually higher, the rate of growth of these plants was actually higher outside of the exclosures. And this is an example of the idea of overcompensation. So these plants are actually increasing their growth rate in response to herbivory. So what is it that actually allows for overcompensation to occur? So this kind of increase in growth rate in response to herbivory. One factor might be differences in grazing intensity. So in some cases, herbivores might feed on older, maybe dying material that then actually exposes younger, healthier plant material to higher intensities of sun. And so you're actually kind of increasing the efficiency of photosynthesis of the plant. A second factor might be defecation from the grazers. So for example, these snow geese, as they graze, they're defecating, and that's going to provide phosphorus and other nutrients for these plants to grow. And thirdly, plants will be affected differently by grazing at different times of year. So this experiment showed overcompensation in these grasses. But if, for example, that grazing happened predominantly towards the end of summer, that might not allow these grasses time to actually recover from that grazing before the winter sets in. So clearly the timing of herbivory is going to play a big part there. And indeed, Hick and Jeffries, who conducted this work, then used those exclosures to manipulate a lot of other factors. So the strength of grazing, the presence of feces. So in some cases, they put geese into the exclosures and then allowed them to feed but removed the feces. They also looked at time of year when grazing occurred, and what they found was that if grazing occurred late on in the year, for example, if they removed feces from those grazed lands, then in those situations, or in a combination of those situations, they tended to find that herbivory actually did have a negative effect on plant productivity. And so while overcompensation is an interesting phenomenon, it doesn't always occur, and indeed it only occurs in specific sets of circumstances that might not come up too often. And indeed, since those initial studies by Hick and Jeffries were conducted, the population of snow geese that are summering in these subarctic salt marshes has increased from less than 2,000 breeding pairs to more than 20,000 breeding pairs. And that increase in the intensity of herbivory has led to a 65% reduction in coverage of these grasses. So hopefully one of the things that this study highlights is that herbivory is not always necessarily a negative thing for plants, but the outcome of that herbivore-plant interaction is going to depend heavily on things like nutrient flow, the timing of herbivory, and also the intensity of the interaction. It's worth noting here as well that while you think of herbivory as an interaction that enhances the fitness of the herbivore and reduces the fitness of the plant, in this case, this increase in population of snow geese has driven the population of the plants down so low that it's unclear what's going to happen to the population of geese in the future, because clearly they've overexploited their resource and there's likely to be a crash in their population at some point in the future. So although there are exceptions, like in the case of overcompensation, it's not surprising to know that in most cases being eaten has a negative impact on reproductive fitness. So as a result, herbivory has driven selection for a huge diversity of defensive traits in plants. And these traits can generally be placed into two major categories. So the first are resistance traits. These are traits that make plants less likely to be eaten. So things like morphological defenses, like thorns or a thick waxy cuticle. Chemical defenses are also resistance traits. The second category is tolerance. So these are traits that reduce the harm associated with being eaten. So many plants like grasses are grazed upon almost constantly, and rather than allocate lots of resources to chemical defenses or morphological defenses, they produce leaf material that's very nutritionally poor, so it's cheap to replace after herbivory. So this is a kind of a form of plant defense, just the tolerance of herbivory. So we're going to focus for a couple of slides now on plant resistance. So these are traits that make plants less likely to be eaten. And these can generally be split into two broad categories: morphological or physical defenses and chemical defenses. So morphological defenses are widespread in plants, and one good example would be the huge thorns on this acacia tree that make it very difficult for this giraffe to feed on the leaves. Now often morphological traits don't actually make it impossible for herbivores to feed on the leaf material, but what they do is they make the process involved in eating that plant more stressful and time-consuming for the herbivore. And often that will mean that in cases like this, giraffes will move on to a different plant where they can graze more easily. The second major category of resistance defense are chemical defenses, and these themselves can be placed largely into two categories. The first are toxins. So these are chemicals that might kill, impair, or repel their herbivores. So these toxins include lots of chemicals that humans use medicinally or recreationally. Things like cocaine, morphine, and nicotine are all chemicals found naturally in plants. The second category are digestion-reducing substances. So these are chemicals that inhibit the breakdown of plant proteins, so by digestive enzymes. So they make the plant material very difficult for the herbivores to digest and gain nutrition from. And an example of one of these would be tannins. And we're familiar with tannins from when we eat an unripe banana. It's that kind of dry sensation that we get in the mouth. And it's interesting to think why an unripe banana would produce these tannins, and those tannins wouldn't be present in a ripe banana. So the presence of herbivores has forced plants to develop this wide array of defensive characteristics. But these defenses that plants have developed themselves have driven specializations in herbivores. So what you end up with is this kind of ecological arms race between the plant and its herbivores. So, for example, some herbivores have developed ways to tolerate defensive chemicals. So this picture on the right is a milkweed that famously produces toxins called cardenolides. So if you break a leaf off this plant, you'll see that kind of milky sap that's very toxic to most herbivores. But some insects, like milkweed bugs or monarch caterpillars, have developed ways to tolerate those chemicals. And what this does, it allows them to exploit this food resource with very little competition from other herbivores that can't digest that plant material. Some of those insects, like the monarch caterpillars, can even actually sequester those toxic chemicals. So what that means is they can kind of store them in their own bodies, and those chemicals then provide them with their own chemical defense against predation. So monarch caterpillars suffer very little predation from birds because they're not really digestible. They contain this high level of cardenolide toxins. So as I mentioned, this kind of reciprocal adaptation between the plants and their herbivores creates this ecological arms race between those two parties. So plants have to be adaptable as well as insects. And plant defenses can be split into two categories in that way. The first being constitutive. This is defenses that are produced continuously, regardless of the environment. And the second category are induced defenses. So these are defenses that are increased rapidly in response to herbivore damage. So these might be chemical defenses that the plants produce only in response to herbivory, extrafloral nectar, which is a kind of nectar that plants produce to attract defensive ants that then remove herbivores. This production of extrafloral nectar often only occurs in response to herbivory or leaf damage. And if you think about it, this makes perfect sense because any organism only has a finite set of resources. So why would that organism allocate lots of resources to defense when maybe in certain cases they don't need those defensive characteristics? So what we tend to find is in tropical environments where herbivory pressures are higher, more defenses are constitutive because it's likely that those plants are going to need to be defended at any given time. Whereas in temperate environments, you get a lot more induced defenses because in many cases these plants don't need to waste their resources by allocating them to defensive traits. So for the next part of the lecture, we're going to focus on the factors that affect prey population dynamics. So there are multiple factors that affect prey population. So the first would be food availability. The second would be consumption by predators, so the direct effect on prey population densities by consumption by predators. And another factor that we'll come on to talk about is non-consumptive effects of predators. So even if a predator doesn't actually feed on a prey organism, the presence of that predator can affect that prey organism behaviourally or physiologically, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a few slides' time. So in terms of prey species population dynamics, probably the best studied example in history is the cycle of abundance in snowshoe hares and their predators in northern Canada. And one of the reasons that this example is so well studied and that we have such good data is that the Hudson Bay Company recorded trapping data throughout basically the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. And so we have this huge amount of population data for these snowshoe hares and their predators, the Canadian lynx. So this graph shows that data that was collected by the Hudson Bay Company. And it depicts these huge peaks and troughs in snowshoe hare populations. So the populations range from a few thousand up to about 150,000. And those cycles in population tend to last between about 5 and 10 years. The striking thing about this graph is the blue line on that graph, which is the population cycles of the hare's predator, the Canadian lynx. And you can see how closely the lynx population matches that of the snowshoe hares. And this is what's ultimately led many ecologists to believe that it's predation, in this case by the lynx, that controls or is a major factor in controlling the population dynamics of the prey, the snowshoe hare. So this system of snowshoe hares and lynx has been studied since the early 1900s, and scientists didn't immediately land on this idea of predators being important in controlling these remarkably regular cycles in population density of the hares. So the first set of theories or hypotheses as to what drove these cycles came from Charles Elton in the 1920s, and he was convinced that these remarkably regular cycles in hare population were driven by plants. So he thought that variation in solar activity or sunspot activity altered plant growth, and that in turn caused variations in hare population sizes. What it was later found out was that variations in sunspot activity over the years didn't match those population cycles in snowshoe hares. And so that theory started to be rejected in the 1950s and replaced by lots of theories to do with overpopulation. So those theories basically suggest that things like disease and parasitism are much greater at high population densities, and that's what starts to cause these drops or crashes in snowshoe hare population. They also suggest that at high population densities, these hares are subject to greater physiological stress, and they're subject to reduced food availability as well. All of those factors are undoubtedly true, but in the 1960s, Lloyd Keith suggested that none of those factors themselves can really be completely behind these regular population cycles in snowshoe hares. And so scientists or ecologists started to think of other reasons or other factors that might control these regular cycles of populations. And it was only then that ecologists really started to look at the effects of predators in controlling these cycles. In the end, though, no one factor can control the population dynamics of these snowshoe hares, but probably the two biggest factors are the role of food supply and the role of predators. So let's talk first about the role of food supply. First of all, these hares have an extremely high potential rate of increase. So what that means is that at their highest rates of increase, the population of these hares can actually double in the space of one generation. And so that can place a lot of pressure on food resources that are available to them, especially in wintertime. So in the wintertime, these hares feed heavily on kind of newly sprouted twigs and buds of understory shrubs and trees. But that high rate of increase means that often there are food shortages associated with really high rates of herbivory by these hares. In addition to food shortages, these hares can elicit induced plant chemical defenses in these plants. And what that does over time is reduce the food quality as well as quantity that's available to these hares. So predators we now know can have a huge impact on these population cycles in snowshoe hares. And recent data has shown that predation can account for 60 to 90% of mortality in these hares during peak densities. What maybe historically we've overestimated is the effects of lynx on those cycles. Because lynx are specialist predators, we've focused on them. They're specialists, which means they only eat these snowshoe hares. But there are also many generalist predators in the area, like goshawks, great horned owls, mink, long-tailed weasels, red foxes and coyotes that feed on the snowshoe hares, but that also feed on lots of other animals in the area as well. And those predators might have just as big an effect on the population dynamics of snowshoe hares as the lynx do. So when a prey population increases, predators can respond to that in two different ways. So the first way is numerical response. So that is, if a prey population increases in density, the predator population can increase in density as well, either through an increase in reproduction or through immigration into that area. The second way that predators can respond to an increase in prey density is functional response. So this is when there's more of that prey available, an individual predator may eat more of those animals or that prey species because of its availability. And what recent studies have shown is that as snowshoe hare populations increase, the numerical response of both lynx and coyotes is high all the way through that increase in hare densities. So as the snowshoe hare population rises, the lynx and the coyote populations continue to rise with it. But what those studies have also shown is that the functional response of lynx levels out at a certain point during that rise in hare populations. But the functional response of coyotes continues to rise all the way through that rise in hare populations. So in other words, as snowshoe hare populations rise, lynx eat more and more snowshoe hares until a certain point, at which point they're satiated and they can't eat anymore. But coyotes, individuals, continue to feed on more and more of those snowshoe hares the higher the population of snowshoe hares gets. And they're able to kind of cache those hares and actually come back to them and feed on them later in the winter. And what this means is that coyotes might be more important, or at least as important, in controlling these cycles of hare populations as the lynx are. So up to this point, when we've thought about the effects of predators on prey populations, we've focused just on the consumptive effects of predation. So this is the direct effect that predators have on prey populations through capture and consumption of prey. But another kind of exciting area of ecology that's developed fairly recently is this idea of non-consumptive effects of predation. So changes to prey as a consequence of predator presence, even when the prey are not killed. And this area of ecology is often referred to as the ecology of fear. So this is the idea that when predators are present, it can have impacts on prey beyond being eaten. So things like morphological shifts in the prey species, changes in stress physiology in those prey species, and also altered behavior. And all of these things can affect the fitness of prey species and their population dynamics. So let's have a look at an example of each of those three different categories of non-consumptive effects of predation. So first of all, morphological shifts. This organism on the right is Daphnia. So these are small water fleas, and the two individuals here, one has a very small spines and one has very large spines. And this is a really well-studied example of phenotypic plasticity. So individuals that grow up in the presence of high levels of predators develop these large spines, and they look like the individual on the left. But populations of Daphnia that grow up without the presence of predators look like the individual on the right. They don't have these spines. So as you can imagine, the individual on the left is more resistant to predation. So this is a form that's helpful to it in the presence of high levels of predators. But this trait of having large spines does come with an ecological cost. So individuals with these spines are less efficient feeders, and so that's going to affect negatively in some cases the population growth of these Daphnia. A good example of predators affecting stress physiology of their prey comes in the form of these snowshoe hares. So recent studies have shown that in plots where lynx are present, snowshoe hares show much higher rates of stress hormones like cortisol. Hares have also been tested for these stress hormones during periods of high lynx populations and during periods of low lynx populations. And when lynx populations are high, these cortisol levels are much higher than when lynx populations are low. Increased cortisol has been shown to negatively affect reproductive rates in female hares. So clearly this change in stress physiology is going to have an effect on population densities of these hares. So the third category of non-consumptive effects of predation is altered behaviour. And a good example of that comes from the relationship between dugongs and their predators, tiger sharks, off the coast of southern Australia in Shark Bay. So these dugongs like to feed in shallow water on high density patches of seagrass. That's where their food quality is at the highest level. But when tiger sharks are feeding in high densities off the coast, what the dugongs like to do is move out to deeper waters, even though the food quality out there is lower. So these dugongs have a kind of food versus safety trade-off that they're operating. So despite the intense pressure that predators place on prey populations, obviously many prey populations do manage to persist. So how do they do this? Well, it's methods of predator avoidance and defense. And generally those mechanisms fall into two categories. First is animal display, and the second is refuge use. So let's focus first on animal display. And one of the major display tactics that prey species use to avoid predators is camouflage. So often that's using shape and coloration, like this grasshopper on the left that blends in well with the grass and the leaves. And the effect that camouflage has on the behaviour of predators is illustrated really well by this example of bald-faced hornets. So bald-faced hornets are these kind of large predatory Hymenoptera, so they're kind of large wasp species. What they do, because they're not particularly good visual hunters, is they just pounce on anything that they think might be prey. And in an experiment conducted by Heinrich in 1984, he found that 70% of the pounces that these hornets did were directed at inanimate objects. Another 20% of these pounces or these attacks by hornets were directed at organisms that the hornets can't eat, so things that are too big or too aggressive. So only 70% of the attacks of these hornets were actually directed at potential prey. And of those, most of the prey animals escaped. So the prey capture rate of these hornets is less than 1%. So it really is all about persistence and taking chances in the case of these hornets. So other forms of animal displays that prey species exhibit to avoid predation are aposematic coloration, Batesian mimicry, and mullerian mimicry. And I'll go through an example of each of those now. So aposematic coloration is where organisms take on bright colours to advertise the fact that they're toxic or distasteful. And a good example of that might be these milkweed bugs. These are bugs that are specialised on feeding on milkweeds, and they sequester those cardinalide toxins, and they advertise the fact that they're distasteful to predators with these kind of bright red colours. They also look a bit like assassin bugs that are predatory insects, so they might be able to kind of deter some predators with that kind of mimicry as well. So this is an example of Batesian mimicry. This is a hoverfly that has coloration very similar to stinging bees and wasps. So Batesian mimicry is where a non-toxic species exhibits coloration similar to that of noxious species living in the same area. So predators that have learnt that species like bees and wasps are not good to eat might avoid this hoverfly thinking that it posed the same threat. And finally, you have mullerian mimicry. This is where several species that are toxic or are noxious in some way, they might be able to sting, they share similar warning coloration. And that's because most prey species aren't born innately knowing that they can't eat these insects or these species. What happens is they feed on them and they learn over time that they're not good to eat. So if many of these species share these same colorations, they might benefit from predatory species learning on other species that these are colorations to avoid. So another major way in which prey species defend themselves against predation is through the use of refugia or refuge use. So these refugia can come in different categories. First, there's spatial refugia. These are physical shelters in many cases, and there are some other examples that I'll touch on. Then there's protection in numbers, is a form of refuge. And then there's the use of individual size as a refuge, and I'll go through quickly some examples of that now. So these are all examples of spatial refugia. You have ground squirrels, and of course many other burrowing animals that use the ground to create their own refugia. Trees provide refuge for many bird species, mammal species, many insect species. So they're a way of seeking shelter from various predators. The sky is a form of refuge for flying animals. So obviously they can avoid any terrestrial predators that way. And it's also true of animals that can use the water sometimes to get away from terrestrial predators. So protection in numbers is another form of refuge. And a good example of that would be masting in Australian trees. These are alpine ash trees in Australia. So masting is when a tree species just synchronously, lots of individuals produce many, many seeds at one time. And what these ash trees do is they produce many seeds and keep them, they retain them on the tree in closed seed pods. Then after a fire event, all of these trees simultaneously drop those seeds. And so there are millions and millions of seeds being dropped at one particular time. So Daniel Jansen in 1978 proposed that this was something that the trees do to get over high levels of seed predation by ants. So usually there are many, many ant species in these habitats in southern Australia, just carrying away those seeds to their nests to be fed on. But by producing these millions and millions of seeds simultaneously, the trees satiate those ants' ability to remove those seeds. And there are many seeds left over to germinate and form the next generation of these ash trees. So another good example of this protection in numbers comes from the insect world. So species of periodical cicada will feed underground as larvae for periods of 13 to 17 years, depending on the latitude. And when they emerge in response to a set of environmental conditions. And so all of these individuals that have been in the larval stage for over a decade will suddenly emerge simultaneously. So you get densities of up to 4 million individuals per hectare. And so obviously many predatory species then like to come and pick off these cicada, but there are enough of them that many of them will survive despite these high levels of predation, and that's enough for them to breed and create the next generation of these insects. So the final form of refuge use is just the use of size as a refuge. So even if you go somewhere like the Serengeti in Africa, where there are a number of apex predators that can kill prey larger than themselves, there's still a size that animals can reach where they're going to be left alone by these predators. And indeed, adult elephants have been known to kill adult lions that are posing a threat to their young. So this slide describes some experimental work that's been done looking at the effect of prey size on predation rates. So this is looking at predation by sea stars on mussels. What they find is that there's a size to which these mussels can grow, above which these sea stars won't eat them. So presumably at that point, the amount of effort it takes to pry open these mussels and to overpower them becomes not worthwhile for these sea stars. Equally, as the sea stars get larger, the minimum size of the mussels that they feed on increases as well. So this kind of optimal foraging range that these sea stars show, whereby they won't attack the smallest mussels because it's not worth their while, and they won't attack the largest mussels because it's too difficult. So a form of refuge in the case of these mussels is to just grow big enough that they'll be ignored by these sea stars. And one thing that experimenters did in this case is they excluded sea stars from a patch of the intertidal zone and allowed the mussels in that patch to grow really large. Then they reintroduced the sea stars, or allowed the sea stars access, and what they found was that predation rates were incredibly low in that patch. because all of these mussels had grown large enough to be ignored by the sea stars.